Hi, this is my lesson analysis, my keystone assignment, um, for to analyze how this lesson conforms with the NGLS standards. Thank you for listening. First, going to introduce this lesson. Let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. So the topic is parts of a plant. The grade level is kindergarten. And the lesson objectives are that students will identify the parts of the plant and how the plants grow. And two is that students will determine what the plant needs to survive. Let me just quickly go over a few of the steps in the lesson. It starts off with a read aloud where the teacher talks about, reads a book to the class about how a Carrot Grows. It's a fiction book. Then the students, together with the teacher, go through the parts of a plant. She labels a diagram on the board. Then the class gets the same diagram on their own without the labels, and they have to label it themselves and color it, put it together. After that, and then again, they repeat it all together. They chorally state all the parts of a plant. And then finally, the teacher gives an extension activity, which is they make their own plant. They put a little seed in a bag and with like wet paper towel. And after a little while, it's supposed to sprout. And then I guess they'll go back to it and talk about it again in a more real life scenario. Now let's dive in and talk about how this lesson fits with any of the educational theories. So I believe this lesson is more based on the behaviorism theory because there is a more passive absorption of knowledge, which is what is promoted by the behaviorism theory. It is more not lecture style, but it is definitely more teacher directed, where the teacher first gives a read aloud, then explicitly teaches the parts of a plant, and then again, even when it is handed over, they again do it together with the teacher, and there is a predetermined body of information. The students are not asked for any additional information or exploration of the idea of plant or what they need to survive. It is more the four basic parts of a plant. They learn it. They learn a little bit about um, the basic necessities of a plant, and that's the only information that they are given and taught. It does have some elements of cognitive constructivism because, as we see, many lessons are not based on purely one educational theory. They sometimes have a mix, depending on the teacher's style and certain aspects of the lesson. Because it does have that take-home project at the end where they do make their own plant. It's very hands-on. This is more student-centered, which is what is promoted by cognitive constructivism. Additionally, students are encouraged to build on the information after. When they come home, they are supposed to discuss it with their parents and hear any additional information. But within the classroom framework, it was more of a predetermined body of information. That's why I have this it sounds maybe like a contradiction, but that's where you have the two aspects of behaviorism and cognitive constructivism. Lastly, there is a very clear gradual release of responsibility, which is great for a kindergarten classroom. It's very structured. It starts with the teacher, I do, then the students, then we do. They talk about it together. They chorally repeat after her. And then finally, it's an I do. The students label it on their own. Um, so I would say this lesson is a bit of a mix based on, I would say, mostly behaviorism and then also elements of cognitive constructivism. Okay, so let's dive right in and read about the NGLS standards that this lesson aligns to. Just a note that this lesson did not have explicit standards written on the lesson plan, but I just read through the NGLS standards and I found some appropriate standards that I believe this lesson intended to hit. So again, and I looked through kindergarten because this lesson was for kindergarten, but I didn't see anything specifically. So I looked a little bit in pre-kindergarten, a little bit in grade 1, and I put them together. So the first one, pre-kindergarten, observe familiar plants and animals, including humans, and describe what they need to survive. And to plan and conduct an investigation to determine if how familiar plants or animals grow. The second one, this is from grade 1. Um, plan and conduct an investigation to determine if plants need sunlight and water to grow. The next one was from kindergarten, developing and using models. So this was a bit of more of the extension of how they go about using these standards in their learning. So this was about using models. Um, They build on prior experiences and progresses to include using and developing models, a diagram, a drawing, physical replica, diorama, dramatization, storyboard that represents a concrete event or design solution, and using a model to represent relationships in the natural world. The next one was to read grade appropriate text and or use media to obtain scientific information to describe patterns in the natural world. And lastly, this one came from the Common Core ELA standards, but it was connected. ELA literacy from kindergarten with prompting and support, and to ask and answer questions about key details in a text. So those, I believe, would be the standards that I would align with this lesson. So now we will go back to each standard and elaborate on how I believe this lesson either utilized or did not exactly meet this standard. So the first one was from pre-kindergarten to observe familiar plants and animals and describe what they need to survive, and to plan and conduct an investigation to determine if plants need sunlight and water to grow. So this is a combination of two different standards, one from pre-kindergarten and one from grade 1, but I believe that they're both very connected and they both have to do with this lesson. And I believe the teacher was trying to meet both of them. This is similar to the concept addressed. It was more of a the parts of a plant, which was the main idea of this lesson, was actually not a science standard for pre-kindergarten to grade 1. So I don't know if it wasn't necessarily a problem. It just means that this specific lesson wasn't perfectly aligned with any science information standard, not in the process of how, but more in the actual what of the learning. So the what of the learning parts of a plant is not a standard for kindergarten and not for pre-kindergarten or grade 1. But this part, which was another, if you remember, another of the lesson objectives was how they survive, plants survive, was mentioned, but more as a side point of the lesson. It definitely wasn't the main point. It was brought about in the fact that the students will be creating their own plants, so they'll have to understand that. And the teacher did mention it in explicit teaching as a side point. So I would say the standard is addressed, but it's just interesting that the what of the lesson, which is parts of a plant, was not really a standard for pre-kindergarten to grade 1. But the lesson did hit this standard, although as more of a side point. The next standard, which is the science and engineering practices. So as NGLS has the what of the learning, and then how. How do they process this information? What mediums do they use? So the science and engineering practices, developing and using models, modeling in K-2 built on prior experiences. So this is about how they present their information by through models. So as I mentioned, this lesson did include it included the standard actually in two ways. Firstly, the students will label and color a plant diagram. So that has to do with, you see, diagram is actually one of the options. This is a physical interpretation of the knowledge that they just the knowledge they just understood. Additionally, the students actually create their own plant, which is also a form of a diorama, a real life, not a diorama, but it's a real life, it's a physical real life model of what they learned. It's the real plant, and they get to see the roots and the stem. Now, my take on this is that a diagram, a flat 2D picture, as a model, I think could be better. A diagram is just a coloring page. It's not so engaging, it's flat. And additionally, in the plant, takes a longer time to grow. So you don't have that immediate impact of here's a model of the plant, this is the roots, this is the stem, this is what we're learning, and students get to see it visually. Because while they do get to see it, it is a few days after the learning happened. So I believe it would be more effective to have a more engaging model on site right there. But yes, it did hit these standards, but I believe it could have been just a bit better. Um, the next one is how they obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. So this is how after the students receive the information, they can display it in the diagram, but how do they evaluate, how do they communicate it? So the standards were reading grade appropriate text and or use media to obtain scientific information. So yes, I believe this lesson had this really done well because it started off with a read aloud, which was the carrot seed. The Carrot Seed is a very interesting fiction realistic story. So it's a read aloud is always a great way to get our students involved and to engage them and to stimulate their thinking. Let's hear what they think. You can ask questions before, you can stop and ask questions during, and always reflect back to that essential question that you promoted in the beginning. But this way, I thought this was great because it does incorporate a text, but it's not a boring informational text, which can be very hard for kindergarten students. However, the students are not doing the reading, but it's focusing on listening comprehension, which I think is fine as a standard for kindergarten. Um, Maybe they could have had something with a little bit more of the students personally reading, but I believe that the read aloud is a great way to incorporate this standard into your lesson. It also connects to the ELA standard, which was with prompting and support, ask and answer questions about details in text. So this lesson definitely incorporated this part as well. So I think it hit this standard very well. Any adjustments? So I would say this lesson was a good lesson. It taught it, it had basic parts. I believe that it could have used a little bit, like I mentioned before, more of a dynamic model, maybe a real plant. She could have brought in a real plant, showed it, displayed it, maybe clay, something like that, a little bit more dynamic than the diagram. Additionally, I believe that the students could have gone outside to find real plants and observe and analyze and compare. It would have gone better with the observing, analyzing, and comparing, and what plants need to survive. I believe if the students had gone out on their own, maybe with a notebook, they can draw pictures of different plants that they see and then compare them or analyze them. That's a little bit more of the stimulating the critical thinking skills. And additionally, as the what of the lesson, a little bit more focus on the what plants need to survive would have been important, because that really was the standard for this age and stage, as opposed to parts of a plant which was not really part of it. So maybe if she could have more done a hybrid of those two, but made it equal focus, it could have been a little better. But all in all, it was a good lesson, a great lesson. And I think it would be effective. I just think these would be maybe a little bit helpful in getting the students more involved and meeting those standards. Lastly, we want to try to reach all students all the time. So the best way to do this is through differentiation, getting all students to be able to learn. So I think one important aspect, I think, is a differentiation of product. That she had the students create this model just by labeling a diagram. I believe, like I said before, I think the more dynamic model would be great anyways, but I think you can have students choose from multiple mediums to create the model of a plant. That way, students could have different students connect better to different things. Someone could do it on a computer. Maybe they're better at that visually. Someone could do it out of clay. Maybe they're very kinesthetic or artistic in that way. Someone could maybe find the parts of a plant in a real outside and label it like that, glue it into their, put it into their notebook like that. Just some different ideas, give them differentiation, have all students be able to use their strengths. I did think that the read aloud was a great way to access all students and have them all learning, because we have multiple students on multiple different reading levels, and just giving them the text, you might lose some students. But when it's a read aloud, all students are able to access the information. I also believe that going outside would help access all students, because some students learn better in the open spaces, connect the ideas more in a more of a concrete manner, as opposed to just hearing about it. I think that if they would see it in real life by going outside and finding things that they're familiar with, this would really help access all students. Um, but thank you for listening. So I hope that if I would make a lesson like this one day, I'll be able to incorporate all these things and really meet all the standards. Thank you for listening.